Michael Chen had been excited about moving into Oak Ridge Estates. After 15 years as an air ambulance pilot, he'd saved enough to afford a home in this upscale suburban community. The neighborhood boasted manicured lawns, community tennis courts, and a reputation for safety. What Michael hadn't factored in was Diane Holloway, the self-appointed enforcer of the Homeowners Association bylaws. Their first encounter happened 3 days after Michael moved in. He was unloading the last of his boxes when Diane marched up his driveway, clipboard in hand, to inform him that his moving truck had been parked 6 inches over the permitted line. Michael apologized politely, even though he knew there was no such regulation. He'd read the HOA guidelines thoroughly, a habit from his days reviewing flight protocols. "Just don't let it happen again," Diane said, making a note on her clipboard. "We have standards in Oak Ridge." Michael nodded and watched her retreat to her house directly across the street. He made a mental note to tread carefully around her, not wanting to make enemies in his new community. That evening, as Michael unpacked his kitchen supplies, the doorbell rang. He opened the door to find an older gentleman with a friendly smile and a casserole dish in hand. "Name's Frank Martinez," the man said. "I live 2 doors down. Thought you might like some dinner after a long day of moving." Michael gratefully accepted the homemade lasagna and invited Frank in for coffee. As they sat at Michael's half-assembled dining table, Frank offered the unofficial welcome to the neighborhood. "I saw you met Diane this morning," Frank said, grimacing slightly. "She's been the neighborhood watchdog for about 12 years now, ever since her husband got transferred overseas and left her with too much time on her hands." "She seems thorough," Michael replied diplomatically. Frank chuckled. "That's one way to put it. She's filed over 300 complaints with the HOA in the past year alone. Most of us just try to stay off her radar." "What's her deal? Why is the HOA giving her so much power?" Michael asked. "Her brother-in-law Richard is the board president. Been that way for almost a decade because nobody else wants the job. Most of us are too busy with our own lives to attend meetings and vote in new leadership." As they talked, Michael learned more about Oak Ridge Estates. The community had been built in the late 1990s on what used to be a small private airstrip. Many of the original homeowners had been pilots or aviation enthusiasts, but most had sold their properties as housing prices rose. Frank himself had been a commercial airline pilot before retirement. "That's actually why I bought here," Michael explained, unpacking a framed photo of himself standing next to a medevac helicopter. "I like the aviation history of the place. Plus, the location is perfect, only 20 minutes from the hospital heliport where I'm based." Frank examined the photo with interest. "Air ambulance, huh? Important work? My son-in-law does search and rescue flying in Colorado." Their conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock. Michael opened the door to find Diane again, this time with a different clipboard. "Your garbage cans are visible from the street," she stated without preamble. "Section 8, Paragraph 4 of the covenant requires all refused containers to be stored out of sight except on collection days." Michael glanced at the side of his garage where he temporarily placed the bins while organizing his space. "I'm sorry, I'm still setting up. They'll be properly stored by tomorrow." "See that they are," Diane replied, then noticed Frank through the doorway. Her expression soared further. "Evening, Frank. Welcoming another rule breaker to the neighborhood." Frank raised his coffee mug in a mock toast. "Just being neighborly, Diane. Something you might try sometime." After she left, Frank sighed. "Word of advice: document everything. Take date-stamped photos of your property regularly. Diane has been known to enter yards when owners aren't home to inspect for violations." Michael raised an eyebrow. "That's trespassing." "Try proving it," Frank shrugged. "Camera systems mysteriously malfunction around her. But don't worry too much. Most of us look out for each other. Welcome to Oak Ridge Estates, where the grass is green and the HOA is mean." Over the next few months, Diane seemed to find fault with everything Michael did. His grass was cut too short. His mailbox was the wrong shade of black. The American flag he displayed as a veteran wasn't illuminated properly at night. Other neighbors warned Michael about Diane's reign of terror. Apparently, she'd driven the previous owners of his house to sell after a 2-year battle over their koi pond. But Michael remained patient, addressing each complaint with calm politeness, the same demeanor that had served him well during tense medical evacuations. "You're handling her better than most," commented Elena Rodriguez, a pediatric surgeon who lived at the end of the street. She and Michael had bonded over their erratic medical schedules. "Most people lose it after the 3rd or 4th citation." "I've dealt with worse," Michael shrugged. "Try navigating a helicopter through a thunderstorm while keeping a trauma patient stable. Diane's clipboard doesn't seem so scary after that." But even Michael's patience had limits. In April, he received a formal letter from the HOA demanding he remove the small memorial garden he planted in honor of his late mother. The letter cited unapproved vegetation and excessive ornamentation. for the simple stone marker and butterfly bush. "This is ridiculous," Frank said when Michael showed him the letter. "Your garden is beautiful and completely within guidelines. Let me talk to some of the other board members." 2 days later, Michael received another letter, this one rescinding the violation, with Diane's signature noticeably absent. It was the first skirmish Michael had won, and Diane didn't take it well. The following weekend, Michael awoke to find his newspaper soaking in a puddle of water despite the clear weather. The day after that, his mail arrived torn and muddy. When his garden hose mysteriously developed multiple punctures, Michael installed a discreet security camera system. The footage captured Diane entering his property at 5:30 a.m. to place a citation on his door for excessive water usage due to a sprinkler he didn't own. Michael sent the video to the HOA board with a polite but firm email about trespassing concerns. The violations stopped temporarily. A situation came to a head when Michael hosted a small housewarming party. He'd notified the HOA as required and made sure all guest vehicles were parked according to regulations. Among his guests were several colleagues from the hospital and a few neighbors, including Frank and Alina. "I've been waiting months to see inside this place," Alina said, admiring Michael's renovated kitchen. "The previous owners kept it dark and closed off. This is so much better." The evening was going wonderfully until someone noticed flashing lights outside. Several guests discovered orange violation stickers plastered across their windshields. "Are you kidding me?" Dr. James Wilson, the hospital's chief of trauma surgery, peeled at the sticker defacing his Tesla. "This thing isn't coming off." From his living room window, Michael watched Diane photographing license plates. When he confronted her, she was unmoved by his anger. "These vehicles are blocking emergency access," she claimed, gesturing to the perfectly legally parked cars. "I'm a medical first responder," Michael said evenly. "I know what constitutes blocked emergency access. These cars are all properly parked." "The citation stands," Diane said, turning to walk away. "The board will review it at the next meeting." "The stickers are damaging expensive vehicle finishes," Michael called after her. "That could be considered property damage." Diane turned back. "Are you threatening me?" "Just stating facts," Michael replied. "Like the fact that my security camera caught you entering my backyard without permission 3 times this month." For just a moment, Diane's composure cracked. Then she recovered. "As HOA compliance officer, I have inspection rights." "Not without 48 hours written notice, you don't," Michael said, quoting the bylaws verbatim. Section 12, paragraph 7. The party mood was ruined, and Michael spent the next day helping his friends remove the adhesive residue from their windows. Dr. Wilson's Tesla required professional detailing, which Michael insisted on paying for himself. "This has gone beyond annoying to actively malicious," Elena said as they carefully applied adhesive remover to her car's window. "What are you going to do?" Michael sighed. "I'm not sure yet, but I'm starting to think this neighborhood isn't big enough for both of us." The real trouble began on a Tuesday morning when Michael was preparing for a 48-hour shift at the hospital. He walked outside to find Diane's SUV parked across his driveway, completely blocking his exit. His repeated knocks on her door went unanswered, and calls to her phone went straight to voicemail. Michael checked his watch. He was due at the heliport in 40 minutes. Lives literally depended on his punctuality. He called an Uber and left a note on Diane's windshield explaining the situation. When he returned home 2 days later, exhausted from multiple emergency flights, he found a citation from the HOA for improper placement of unauthorized materials on a vehicle, his note, and a $75 fine. "You've got to be kidding me," Michael muttered, staring at the official-looking notice with Diane's unmistakable signature. He was still in his flight suit, having come directly from a grueling double trauma transport. His shift had included airlifting a family of 4 from a remote car accident, and he'd spent the entire flight performing CPR on the youngest child while his co-pilot navigated through turbulence. All he wanted was a shower and sleep. Instead, he found himself calling Frank. "She blocked you in," Frank said incredulously. "That crosses a line from annoying to dangerous. What if there had been an emergency call-out?" "Exactly," Michael replied, rubbing his eyes. "I'm going to talk to her once I've had some sleep." But when Michael knocked on Diane's door the next morning, she was the picture of innocence. "Mechanical failure," she explained with a thin smile. "These things happen. I called a tow truck as soon as I could." "At exactly the time my shift started," Michael pointed out, "and it was working fine the night before when you drove to the grocery store." Diane's smile tightened. "Are you spying on me, Mr. Chen?" "That sounds like harassment." "Just like blocking someone's driveway sounds like harassment," Michael countered. This standoff might have remained a one-time issue, but it happened again the following week. Once again, Michael was preparing to leave for his shift when he found Diane's SUV strategically positioned to block his exit. This time he called a tow truck immediately, but by the time they arrived, Diane had appeared and moved her vehicle, claiming she'd forgotten something and had only intended to be there momentarily. The third time it happened, Michael had his phone ready and recorded video of the blockage, capturing the license plate and the precise positioning that made it impossible for him to leave. He also documented his attempts to contact Diane. When he returned from his shift, he went straight to the local police station. Officer Rodriguez, no relation to Elena, reviewed the footage sympathetically. "Look, I understand your frustration, and this definitely appears intentional," he said. "But technically, this is a civil matter. The street is public property, and unless she's blocking for extended periods or creating a safety hazard." "I'm an emergency medical pilot," Michael interrupted. "If I can't get to the hospital, people could die. How is that not a safety hazard?" The officer sighed. "I can talk to her, but we can't arrest someone for bad parking. Have you tried the HOA?" Michael had indeed approached the HOA board. The meeting had gone exactly as he'd expected, with Richard Holloway, Diane's brother-in-law, presiding. "While we sympathize with your situation," Richard had said in a condescending tone, "there's nothing in the bylaws that prohibits temporary street parking. Perhaps you should consider parking on the street yourself if driveway access is such a concern for you." When it happened a fourth time, Michael took more drastic measures. He called not only a tow truck but also his hospital administrator to explain the situation. Dr. Patel, the director of emergency services, was furious. "This is unacceptable," she declared. "I'm sending security footage from the hospital showing your arrival times. We'll document the delays this has caused to emergency response. I'll also have our legal team draft a letter explaining the public safety implications." Despite this support, the pattern continued. Diane became more sophisticated, moving her vehicle just before tow trucks arrived, but after Michael had been forced to find alternative transportation. She seemed to have an uncanny knowledge of his schedule, which Michael suspected came from monitoring his comings and goings. After the fifth incident, Michael sat in his kitchen, surrounded by useless documentation. Police reports, HOA complaints, even a cease and desist letter from the hospital's lawyer that Diane had simply ignored. There had to be another solution, something he hadn't considered yet. Frustrated but not defeated, Michael began researching his options. During a late-night dive into local zoning laws, he discovered something interesting. His property, located at the edge of the development, fell into a unique zoning category that had been grandfathered in when the subdivision was built. Technically, with the right permits, he could designate part of his property for aviation use. Further research revealed that private helipads were indeed legal in their county, provided they met safety regulations and were used primarily for medical or emergency purposes. As a licensed medical transport pilot with connections in the aviation community, Michael realized he had a unique opportunity. He contacted Sarah Jenkins, a land use attorney who had successfully challenged the same HOA years earlier over solar panel restrictions. Over coffee, she confirmed his interpretation of the zoning laws. "It's a long shot," Sarah admitted, "but legally sound if you're willing to invest in the proper safety measures and paperwork. The FAA would need to approve it, and there's a noise study requirement, but your medical service background actually works in your favor." For the first time in months, Michael smiled. "I'm not looking to cause trouble," he told Sarah. "I just want to be able to get to work without being blocked in." Michael spent the next week gathering documentation about his property. He discovered that his house and the surrounding 3 properties had once been part of a small private airfield that predated the development. When the land was subdivided in the late 1990s, the developer had been required to maintain certain aviation easements as part of the approval process. These easements had been buried in the fine print of property documents and largely forgotten, but they were still legally binding. "This is gold," Sarah said when Michael showed her the original subdivision plans he'd obtained from county records. The HOA regulations specifically exempt pre-existing easements from their jurisdiction. They can regulate the color of your mailbox, but they can't touch aviation rights that were established before the HOA even existed. While the legal groundwork was promising, Michael knew he needed practical expertise as well. He called his colleague Jackson Williams, who had transitioned from medical flights to aviation safety consulting. "A private helipad? In a subdivision?" Jackson laughed when Michael explained his idea. "That's ambitious, even for you. But if anyone could pull it off legally, it would be a medical pilot with a perfect safety record." Over beers at a local pub safely outside Oak Ridge Estates, Jackson laid out what Michael would need: enhanced drainage systems, reinforced ground surfaces, proper lighting, fire suppression capabilities, and comprehensive safety protocols. None of it was impossible, but it would be expensive. "Think of it as an investment in your sanity," Jackson suggested. "And who knows? Having direct helicopter access could increase your property value in the long run." Michael's research expanded to include FAA regulations and environmental impact studies. He learned that noise concerns could be mitigated by limiting operational hours and using specific approach and departure paths that minimize disturbance to surrounding homes. The fact that Michael's property sat at the neighborhood's edge, backing up to a small commercial zone, worked in his favor. Alina proved to be another valuable ally. Her father had been on the county planning commission and she still had connections in the department. "You'll need to file for a conditional use permit," she explained during one of their now regular Sunday morning coffee meetings. "I can introduce you to someone who can guide your application through without attracting too much attention." "Is that legal?" Michael asked. "Absolutely. The whole point of these permits is to allow uses that aren't standard but still compatible with the area's zoning. Your situation fits perfectly. You got a legitimate need due to your profession, and there's historical precedent for aviation use on the property." She smiled. Plus, it would be worth it just to see Diane's face. As Michael's plan took shape, he was careful to keep it quiet. He began making subtle preparations, reinforcing his back patio, improving drainage, installing industrial-grade electrical conduits that could support safety lighting, all disguised as general property improvements. Each change was meticulously documented and permitted through the appropriate channels, completely separate from HOA jurisdiction. Of the brewing conflict with Diane, "The homeowners on Maple Street are concerned about property values," Frank informed Michael one evening. "I tried explaining that a medical helipad could actually increase values in the long run. Quick emergency response times are a selling point, but they're worried about noise." To address these concerns, Michael hosted small informational gatherings explaining the strict limitations he would place on the helipad's use and the modern noise reduction techniques employed by medical helicopters. He emphasized that landings would be rare and limited to genuine emergencies or essential maintenance checks. The most technically challenging aspect was the lighting system, which needed to be bright enough for safety during emergency nighttime landings but unobtrusive to neighbors. Michael worked with a specialist who designed recessed directional lights that would remain inactive until needed, then provide critical illumination without excessive light pollution. Meanwhile, Diane continued her campaign of harassment, now focusing on the construction work in Michael's backyard. She filed complaints about noise, work hours, and unauthorized landscaping changes. Each time, Michael produced the appropriate permits, which infuriated her further. "She tried to get into my backyard yesterday to take pictures," Michael told Sarah during their weekly update. Workers caught her climbing over the side fence. The plan came together on a Saturday morning when Diane had scheduled the annual HOA meeting in her front yard, directly across from Michael's house. The agenda included a proposed ban on excessive home renovations, clearly targeted at Michael's recent work. Michael had known about the meeting for weeks. Diane had made sure every homeowner received multiple notices, highlighting the urgent need to address property modifications that threaten our community standards. What she didn't know was that Michael had been planning for this moment with military precision. The night before, he called James Peterson, his former flight instructor who now worked for the same medical transport company. "Everything's set," James confirmed. "Hospital administration approved the test flight as part of our emergency landing site verification program. Perfectly legitimate." "And the timing?" Michael asked. "I can hit your coordinates at exactly 10:15 a.m. Weather looks clear when conditions favorable. It'll be textbook." Michael smiled. "Perfect. Just make sure to approach from the east. I want everyone to have a good view." Saturday morning dawned bright and clear. By 9:30 a.m., Diane had arranged folding chairs in neat rows across her front lawn. Nearly 30 residents gathered, sipping coffee from paper cups and nibbling on the mandatory refreshments. Michael watched from his living room window, noting the unusually high attendance. Apparently, the promise of drama was a powerful draw. At precisely 10:05 a.m., Michael changed into his official flight uniform, complete with medical transport insignia and credentials. He reviewed his documentation one last time: permits, approvals, safety certificates, zoning variances, and the critical notice about emergency vehicle access. Everything was in order. Outside, Diane was hitting her stride. As we can all see, she gestured dramatically toward Michael's property. Certain residents have taken it upon themselves to make unauthorized modifications that fundamentally alter the character of our community. Several neighbors shifted uncomfortably. A few glanced toward Michael's house, wondering why he hadn't attended to defend himself. Richard Holloway, standing beside his sister-in-law with the same smug expression, added, "The board has drafted a new bylaw that would require special approval for any exterior renovations exceeding standard maintenance. This would ensure that all," as Diane was mid-sentence about maintaining neighborhood character. The distinctive sound of helicopter blades cut through the air. The thump-thump-thump grew louder, drowning out her words. Heads turned skyward as a small medical helicopter with the hospital's logo prominently displayed circled overhead and then began a careful descent toward Michael's property. "What on earth?" Diane's voice rose to a shriek as she realized what was happening. The crowd stood transfixed as the helicopter executed a perfect approach, hovering briefly before settling gently onto what everyone had assumed was simply Michael's renovated patio. Wind from the rotors scattered some of Diane's carefully arranged papers, sending them swirling across the street. The moment the blaze began to slow, Michael walked calmly from his front door, dressed in his flight uniform, and approached the helicopter with practiced professionalism. James emerged from the cockpit and greeted him with a crisp salute, which Michael returned before they shook hands. "System check complete, Captain Chen," James said loudly enough for the nearest neighbors to hear. "The emergency landing site meets all safety parameters. I'll file the final certification when I return to base." The impromptu audience had abandoned any pretense of interest in the HOA meeting. Several people had their phones out recording the scene. Frank stood at the back of the crowd, not even trying to hide his delighted grin. Diane recovered her composure enough to march across the street, her face contorted with fury, clipboard clutched like a weapon. "This is absolutely prohibited," she shouted over the diminishing engine noise. "This is a residential neighborhood, not an airport. I'm calling the police." Michael smiled politely and handed her a folder containing copies of all his permits, FAA approvals, and a letter from the county zoning board confirming the legality of his helipad. He also included a formal notice that any vehicle blocking access to an emergency medical transport facility, which his driveway now legally was, would be immediately towed at the owner's expense and could result in civil penalties. "The police are welcome to stop by," Michael said calmly. "They've already inspected and approved the installation." Officer Rodriguez was particularly helpful during the final safety certification. The HOA meeting disbanded in chaos as residents peppered Michael with questions. Rather than gloating, he invited everyone over for impromptu coffee and explained his situation: the blocked driveway, his work as a medical pilot, and the importance of reliable transportation in his line of work. "I understand this is unconventional," Michael acknowledged as neighbors gathered around his kitchen island, where he quickly set up a coffee station. "But after having my driveway repeatedly blocked on days I was scheduled for emergency flights, I needed a solution that couldn't be interfered with." Alema jumped in. "Michael transports critically injured patients. When he can't get to work because someone deliberately blocks his driveway, people could literally die." This perspective shifted the mood in the room. What had initially seemed like an extreme response to a neighborhood dispute now appeared justified when framed as a matter of public safety. "Why didn't you just call a tow truck?" asked Barbara Thompson, who lived 3 doors down. "I did multiple times," Michael explained. "But by the time they'd arrived, the vehicle would mysteriously be moved. Meanwhile, I'd already had to find alternative transportation and explain to my supervisor why I was late for my shift." Many neighbors were fascinated by the helicopter and impressed by Michael's thoroughness. James offered small groups tours of the aircraft, explaining the advanced medical equipment and safety features. Several parents brought their excited children to see the helicopter up close, turning what could have been a neighborhood scandal into something of an educational event. Throughout the day, different neighbors shared their own stories of run-ins with Diane's overzealous enforcement. The paddles had been cited for planting culturally significant flowers that weren't on the approved vegetation list. The Goldsteins had faced weekly complaints about their solar panels until they hired an attorney. Even Richard Baker, a retired judge who rarely engaged in neighborhood politics, admitted that Diane had once reported his grandson's wheelchair ramp as an unauthorized structure. "I should have spoken up sooner," Judge Baker said, his voice carrying the weight of his former authority. "What she's been doing goes beyond enforcing rules. It's targeted harassment." By afternoon, when it started as a neighborhood scandal, had turned into something of a community reckoning. Several longtime residents began discussing the need for HOA reform and more balanced enforcement of regulations. Frank, who had been quietly observing the shifting dynamics, pulled Michael aside. "You know, we've had an opening on the board for months that nobody wanted to fill. After today, I think you'd have a lot of support if you decided to run." Michael looked surprised. "Me? I'm hardly the HOA type." "That's exactly why we need you," Frank insisted. "Someone who understands both rules and reason." In the following weeks, several things changed in Oak Ridge Estates. A special HOA meeting was called, and this time attendance was nearly universal. Judge Baker nominated Michael for the open board position, seconded by no fewer than 12 homeowners. Richard Holloway, sensing the shift in community sentiment, didn't even attempt to block the nomination. The revised HOA bylaws, drafted with input from a committee that included Michael, Alina, Frank, and several other homeowners, included clearer rules against blocking driveways and a more structured process for filing complaints. Any violation report now required photographic evidence and citation of specific bylaws, and all enforcement actions needed approval from at least 2 board members, ending Diane's unilateral reign. "We're not throwing out the rulebook," Michael explained during the vote on the new procedures. "We're just making sure it's applied fairly and with common sense. A community should have standards without creating adversaries."